My name is Annette Gordon-Reed. I'm the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University. I'm a law professor, and I'm also a historian. People often ask me how I ended up writing a book about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Jefferson and Monticello had been a long-standing interest of mine from the time I was in the third grade when I read a third grade biography of Jefferson, and that was my introduction to the person who wrote the American Declaration of Independence, saying all men are created equal, but was also the person who owned enslaved people. And from a young age, I wondered about that contradiction. All men are created equal and holding people in bondage. And of course, that is the American dilemma that we've dealt with for many, many years now. Some years ago, 1994, they made a movie about Jefferson in Paris. And when the movie came out, there were a number of historians who were saying things like, Jefferson would never have had a relationship with an enslaved woman. There's no evidence that Jefferson had a relationship with an enslaved woman. And they were upset about this movie because it was going to treat the story as if it were true. Well, I knew from my reading that there was, in fact, evidence that Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. A man named Madison Hemings gave his recollections of life at Monticello, growing up there with Jefferson as his father. There was another enslaved person who gave recollections, who talked about Monticello and corroborated what Madison Hemings had to say. So I knew that wasn't proof, but it was evidence. And I thought it was particularly insulting to suggest that when enslaved people told you about what life was like in slavery, that people went on the attack and accused them of lying. And at the same time, when Jefferson's legal white family said the reason all of Sally Hemings' children look like Thomas Jefferson is that they were the children of his nephews. A plausible story in the sense that people could, in fact, look like their cousins and nephews and uncles and so forth. But there was nothing to back up what these people were saying. Yet historians believed them just because it got Jefferson off the hook, so to speak. So what I wanted to do in my book as a law professor, talking to the reader the way I talk to law students, is to say there are two competing stories. How do we decide who is telling the truth? What is more likely? What is more plausible? And as I worked on the book, as I fleshed out these arguments and began to look at the story, really, I could see that there was much more evidence supporting what Madison Hemings had to say, and absolutely no evidence supporting what Jefferson's legal white family had to say about how this story unfolded at Monticello. The book came out in 1997. Got a lot of attention because Jefferson is a popular figure for biographies and so forth, and a lot of people wanted to hear what I had to say about it. Things really took off in 1998 when DNA testing was done on the descendants of members of the Hemings family, members of the Jefferson family, and members of the Carr family. Those were the nephews who were supposed to be the fathers of Sally Hemings' children. And the DNA came back and showed that there was a connection between the Hemings and Jefferson. There was no connection to the Carr story. So along with what I had written in my book, along with the information from the DNA testing, there was a sea change in understanding about this story. I should say among historians. Members of the public didn't seem to have a problem with this. It was mainly historians, white historians, who did not like the idea that Jefferson had fathered children with Sally Hemings. So November 1st, 1998, this was announced all over the world. They had actually embargoed the story. I learned what was going to happen, I think it was on a Monday, and all the newspapers around the world agreed to hold off in reporting it until the following Sunday, so it could make the Sunday papers. And that event really changed my life because I had written this book and something had happened that very rarely happens in history, is that science comes in and corroborates what it is that I had to say. So that changed my life, and as I began to think more about this situation, it occurred to me that one of the reasons that people had been so quick to dismiss what members of the Hemings family had to say and what other enslaved people had to say about life at Monticello was that people didn't know them. When you know someone, when you have a connection to a person, you pay attention to them in a different way. So I also knew that Jefferson was an inveterate record keeper. He had lots of records about members of the Hemings family. Some members of the family were literate, so we have some of their letters as well. And they had a very strong family history about their ancestors and their forebears and what life had been like. So what I set out to do was to write a book that made them sort of live as individuals and to remind people that Sally Hemings was not just enslaved. She was a daughter, she was a sister, she was a mother, she was an aunt, she was people's friends. And if you think of her as a well-rounded person, and if you think of not just her, but think of her in the context of a family, it made me think that people would be much more careful with their stories, careful with the way they wrote about them. And so this was a point for me, not just about the Hemingses. It was about all enslaved people. It always struck me as perverse, I would say, actually, for people to be more concerned about the welfare and the honor and the stories of people who were enslaving other people than they were about the people who were living under that oppression. Typically, we reserve our sympathy for the people who are victims. And there's no question that members of the Hemings family and the other hundreds of people who were enslaved at Monticello over the course of Jefferson's life were victims. And he knew that. He wrote some of the most trenchant criticisms of slavery of anyone. And so he knew that he was victimizing people. So we can't, take the position of protecting him at the expense of the people whom he knew he was doing harm to. So the purpose of the book was not just to write about an item of salacious gossip, people sleeping with people and so forth, or rape, or however you want to characterize it. It was to talk about the way historians wrote about Black people. Because I think that one of the legacies of slavery is a double standard in thinking about evidence and taking the words of African American people when they say things that make white people feel uncomfortable. So the book, both of those books, were my efforts to try to change or to change the way people write about enslaved people, particularly when enslaved people were involved with members of the founding generation, whom Americans revere and don't want to believe bad things about. But the truth of the matter is slavery, people keep calling it America's original sin. That may not be appropriate, but that's the idea, that this is something that was there from the very, very beginning, and we're still struggling with the legacies of slavery today. So if we get these stories right, I think it's much more likely that we can move towards a future where all people are treated as if they're created equal, and that we can realize the dream that Jefferson talked about in the American Declaration of Independence, and that African Americans, gay people, women, all people have used the words of the Declaration to make a place for themselves in the American nation. And that contribution has to be seen alongside the fact that Jefferson enslaved people, and that is the American dilemma writ large right there on the mountain.